to be off video because I keep getting pushed off of Zoom. So I'll just come on and off as you need me.
Okay.
All right, I'll let you know soon. And then give me 1 minute or less than a minute. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, should I guess I am opening the board retreat for September 25th for the Marin Municipal Water District. And it looks like we need an approval of the agenda for today.
Move approval.
Second.
Guess we need a roll call vote. Or do we?
Director Bragman,
Aye.
Director Kohler,
Hi.
Director Russell,
Aye.
and President Gibson.
Aye. And I guess with that, we have,
I'll kick it off, President Gibson. If that works.
let the good times roll.
Okay. Well, good morning, board members. We have refreshments on the back table. Help yourself. Yeah, no, of course, we're on Zoom, and
Grubhub's coming, right?
we'd rather be in person, of course, not just for refreshments, but the sort of engagement that you really only get in person. But we're going to do our best to get through, targeting about 3 hours for a retreat. We'll miss the informal dialogue that occurs in a retreat, you know, between items and on breaks and that sort of stuff. But in your packet, you have a write-up on 10 items, and they were selected due to the strategic nature, the relative priority, and/or the policy implications of the particular initiatives. Today, we're planning to present the first 5 that are noted in the agenda, and the others will be brought to you at subsequent board meetings or quarterly updates we'll be bringing throughout the year on these strategic initiatives. Today, staff's looking forward to your input on these 5 items we'll be discussing. And for the most part, what we're bringing today is kind of a look ahead for this next year in terms of process and schedule and substance, and really how we're going to be delivering these items and engaging with the board and public on them, and looking forward to your feedback on that. Specifically, just touching on them, Chuck and Jeannie are going to kick us off with the next steps in the development of our 10-year financial plan, which will serve as a foundation and be a living document for our efforts and priorities over the next 10 years. That'll be followed by Lucy with a water system master plan project, a very significant endeavor for us over the next couple years to help guide our long-term investments in the district's infrastructure. Sean will then share a proposed watershed recreation plan development to help us think through a long-term vision on how we consider and invest in supporting the many diverse users on our watershed while maintaining the high quality water supply, the biodiversity, and all the shared aspects of this special resource we're entrusted with. Paul will then provide an update on our activities associated with our supplemental water supply from Sonoma Water, with an emphasis on how we may be able to increase the resiliency of this critical component of our water portfolio. And finally, Carrie will provide a review of our current drought plan and share recent state requirements we'll be taking on that will require a fairly comprehensive update to the plan. So quite a bit we're gonna get through. In terms of logistics this morning, we're planning to run through the material and conclude the meeting by noon. We don't have a defined break this morning. We'll check in during the workshop if the board would like a 10-15 minute break or prefer us just to keep moving. Your call certainly on that. And then lastly, these issues, of course, reflect just a slice of the pie of the work of the district. And really the most important work of the district is the day-to-day. The day-to-day work of staff treating and distributing the water, maintaining our system and our watershed, and all the support work that goes into allowing those core activities to continue. And, you know, just reflective for a minute that generally, but particularly with the challenges we've had this past year, I've been, and I know the board has been, because you've all shared it with me, just so appreciative of the staff here at the district in the day-to-day work of the organization. So with that, unless there's any questions or comments from the board, we'll move into the first item, the 10-year financial plan with Chuck.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Can we all see that?
Yep.
Okay.
All right, good morning, members of the board, staff. Today, this morning, we're talking through the 10-year financial plan. I'm going to do it in concert with Jeannie. We also have a member of Raptelis with us, Steve Gagnon. He will be handling the financial modeling side of this. We have Melissa Elliott, also Raptelis, who will be helping us with outreach. She was unavailable to join this morning due to personal reasons, but she'll be a big part of this process. Raptelis was selected after we did a nationwide search, did a request for proposals, and Raptelis had the winning proposal. And we're just starting to kind of embark on this long-range plan. You have the next slide, Gene. So some of the things that we'll talk to you about this morning, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the overall project goal and then the financial plan. And then Jeannie's going to talk to you about board workshops, community engagements, and then we can talk a little bit about what the next steps are in this project. So our project goal overall is to develop a long-range financial plan. And the reason that's important, if you think about the way that we do our financial planning, it's usually really in a close-in way. So when we come to you with a budget, it's a 2-year budget, and it's really capturing kind of what the immediate needs and priorities are. And kind of the same thing can be said when we do cost of service analysis and when we do rate setting. We're kind of looking close in. To my knowledge, this is the first time that the districts kind of look to do a long-range plan. So we kind of want to pick up our vision, look out to the horizon, and realize that, you know, we're obviously a going concern that's going to be around for centuries. And we instead of thinking about what's happening in the next 2-year horizon, we need to be thinking long-term about what we have to do to sustain our infrastructure, to get our organization to a place where it needs to be for the long run. So that's what this project is really at its heart about. You have the next slide, Jean, please. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the financial plan development. And like I say, when you think about this, it's really not, it's a financial plan, but it's really a strategic document is what we're trying to build here, so that we're kind of thinking about what we have to do to sustain the organization. So really, when we look at it from a financial standpoint, there's really 2 components to this, just like there would be with any kind of budget. And so first of all, we're going to be looking at capital investments, and we want to kind of take a look, a holistic view at what our capital needs are. So some of these things will be traditional things that you've seen in budgets and in cost of service analysis. Obviously, we're looking at things like our pipes, things like our treatment plants, those type of big capital infrastructure pieces. But as part of this, we're also looking at what the organization has to look like. So, for example, one of the things that we're looking at a capital investment is the replacement of our existing ERP system. We have SAP. It's been in place for, my understanding, over a decade. It's going to come to end of life within the next several years. And we need to think about what we're going to be doing to replace that system, or if we're replacing it or upgrading it, it's going to be a very large commitment. And the commitment extends not just to a replacement of, you know, IT infrastructure. We also have to think about what the operational needs are around that. So what I mean by that is we may decide that we have to change what the structure of our IT department looks like in order to support that system, because that system can have different components. Instead of just being payroll, general ledger, and those type of things, we may be adding things like inventory management or workflow processes that are integrated with those systems. So we're kind of trying to get the organization to look holistically at those things that we need to do. On the operational side, obviously the things you think about are personnel and maintenance and operations costs. We are encouraging all the divisions to look at their organizational structure. And again, to look at what you need in the long run. Some of that's maybe traditionally thinking about adding personnel. So when we look at things like rangers on the watershed, that may be something that will be asked for. And I'm just putting these out as examples. But we're also asking the divisions to look at the way that you're structured. So again, back to, I have information technology under me. Currently, we have 8 people in that department, and that may be the right number of people, but maybe we don't have the right structure there. So if we're thinking about building large innovative systems, those systems are going to have to be tended to, and we're going to have people who can do things like project management. So we're asking the divisions and departments to look at the way they're structured and think about that. We also, it's not on the slide here, but we're going to look at a couple of other things too, outside of just what our capital investments are and what our operational needs are. We can look at what our reserve levels are. So right now the district has a policy for our reserves in case we have some sort of event that requires us to float ourselves for several months. We've also, the board has thoughtfully put into place other reserves like rate stabilization. We have a pension reserve. What this process is going to allow us to do is to look at those reserves and see if they're at the right levels. So, things like pensions where you have a lot of volatility, a lot of increasing costs, maybe it would be wise to increase the reserve for that pension. So just some of those things are the things that we'll be going through. We're going to look at, financing opportunities. So if we have projects that are of extreme priority, we may want to examine ways to finance those so that we can do them sooner rather than in a pay-go way, so that we can get those processes moving. And then another piece of this will be the modeling that we do, the financial modeling. So in a long-range forecast, we kind of want to see what the trajectory is, even on the status quo. So those things, those costs like electricity, personnel costs, where are those going, and what are those going to look like in the long run, and how do we set ourselves up to manage those things? You have the next slide, Jeannie. So financial plan development. This obviously is going to involve all the stakeholders. It's going to involve the community. It's going to involve the board. It's going to involve staff. This is going to be a kind of an all hands on deck process, and it's going to be an iterative process. So, Jeannie will talk a little bit about the board workshops, but this is going to take a number of workshops to go through and kind of get this long range plan built. And once we have this thing built, as Ben mentioned, this isn't something that we put in a binder and stick on a shelf. This is going to be a living document. So, every time that we go through a cost of service analysis or we do a budget, we're going to be looking at this long-range strategic plan and seeing if the elements that we develop still make sense. One of our plans right now, and this is still in development with Raftellus, the way that we approach this, is that we want to bring scenarios to the board. So the easiest example I can think of that is we look at our current replacement of tanks, and we say this is what the status quo is, and then we look at what additional service on those is. So if we wanted to replace tanks at a faster rate, that could be scenario 1, and that would have this kind of a cost associated with it. If we wanted to increase that even more, we'd have a second scenario with a greater cost associated with it. And this will kind of allow us to set up all of these different CIP and operational needs in kind of buckets, and in conjunction with the board and all of our stakeholders, kind of sort out what the priority is. Because obviously, whenever you do these kind of plans, the need is going to exceed the resources. So we have to have some way of kind of prioritizing all of this stuff and deciding how we handle this in the long run. So that's that's what the process is on the finance side. At this time, I'll turn it over to Jeannie to talk a bit about the board workshops.
Thank you, Chuck. So as Chuck mentioned, we really envision this process to be guided and informed by board input and by community engagement. So we're still in the planning process of the real details of what the workshops will look like, but we wanted to share with you the direction that we're heading for these board workshops. So right now we envision a series of 4 workshops. And the first workshop will really be an overview of all of the elements of the investment scenarios. So as Chuck mentioned, a discussion of the capital asset classes and the different levels of investment. We're also going to be taking a look at some of the operational needs and opportunities that Chuck mentioned. So leading us into the second workshop, and based on what we learned from that first workshop, the plan is to provide a range of scenarios for both capital and operating investments. And there's where we have the discussion on the levels of investment and the resources really that would be needed to implement those scenarios. Then we're going to listen to the feedback and come back for the third workshop where we will really begin putting together the financial scenarios. So we envision that this workshop will include scenarios that have been refreshed and refined, and possibly potentially new scenarios that develop from our discussions during the workshops. And at this time, the financial model will also be updated to properly reflect all of the input that we'll be collecting during this time. Moving into the fourth workshop, excuse me, we'll be looking at all of the outstanding issues and trying to tie everything together. And here's where we'll be talking about the overall narrative for the financial plan. And that should include what the district's current state is and what its vision for the future is in terms of investments. And in this workshop, we'll also share the roadmap for how we intend to successfully implement that 10-year plan. So on the community engagement piece, we're really envisioning that this piece will run parallel with the board workshop so that we can take what we learn from the community engagement sessions and really help that or use that information to inform some of our workshops. So the community engagement piece is designed to create a greater understanding really of the district's challenges and opportunities. And it builds on some of the virtual engagement that we are all becoming very familiar with, the webinars, some of these online communities, really tapping into some other organizations, community meetings as well to share our information. And that will include social media and some other digital platforms. We're thinking that this will be a real low-key informational setting, and that's really designed to provide greater opportunities for participation and for feedback, and really to engage with broader and more diverse audience so that we can get the feedback we need to inform the process. So the digital outreach program piece of that, we're really focused on the infrastructure investments on one hand and commitment to environmental stewardship. So trying basically to capture those two components of the district's mission. Alongside that, we'll have a media plan to help us tell the story of how these investments will really benefit the community's needs. And we'll do that through a series of opinion pieces, articles, and we'd like to do some videos as well. So I will just briefly go through some of the next steps, and Chuck, please feel free to weigh in. So right now, as staff develop the CIP and operating list, the senior management team and Raftelis will assess those priorities and really develop some initial scenarios so that we can begin kicking off board workshops in the community engagement process. And all of that information will, of course, then be incorporated into the financial plan. Just to give you a high-level look at some timeline information, we plan to be working with Raftelis very soon in the next couple of weeks to just plan and get the research work done. Our goal is to target the board workshops to begin early next year in January after the holidays. And as I mentioned, the community engagement piece will be designed to run in parallel with the board workshops. And finally, by August of 2021 or sometime early in the fall, the financial plan and the reports are expected to be completed and delivered. And that's what we have for you. Happy to take any questions.
Are the, Jeannie, excuse me, are the workshops, I assume we're planning to do these by Zoom meetings or something like that?
Yes, yes. And in the current environment, that is our plan.
Okay.
Don't we need to get our rate litigation somewhat handled before we embark on a financial plan? I mean, that seems to be sort of foundational to any 10-year plan, is figuring out how we're going to set a rate structure that's going to meet our needs.
Ben, you're on mute.
I think that's a good comment. The way we're looking at these is the litigation issues are somewhat separate from the business of the district, but we do recognize there's going to be external factors that will influence this. Is why we're calling it a living document. And that could be new regulations. It could be the consequence of litigation, could be some other external factors. So we'll be continuing to adapt this as we go forward based on those external factors, some of which we control and much of which we can't.
Yeah. So we have a pretty important election coming up too, which may affect funding and other external factors. And then the other thing that just struck me is, and no criticism of Chuck, was the just the example of replacing SAP, which I thought we just did fairly recently, or
Yeah.
upgraded it.
Yeah,
But-
we do minor upgrades to it, but no, the SAP system is pretty old. We're actually,
Well, Chuck, we spent $1 million. It wasn't, I wouldn't call that minor, but as I recall on that, I think that's a very serious issue though, because, you know, we've been, in my understanding, so successful with SAP. And I have a difficulty understanding why we would want to change the enterprise software system, but you know, my ears are wide open. A couple of other comments though. I didn't understand your comments, Chuck, about increasing pension volatility. I didn't get that. I think we should be increasing that pension fund. It has really, it's not aimed at volatility. It's aimed at the term unfunded liability. So the idea is, you know, we put money into that account so that there is no unfunded liability after, say, 25 years or something like that. And, you know, you may not have heard my talking on this before, but I don't like the term unfunded liability, because every business, every expense in the future is an unfunded liability. There's nothing unique about pensions that is different than paying the PG&E bill or the some labor bill. So, you know, I think it's a misconstrued concept. But with that said, it's still a good idea to address that issue and to put money aside now so that you don't just depend on the Social Security plan of just ever increasing staff to pay the bills.
yeah, and I brought that up as an example of you know, one of the main drivers of personnel costs. And when I mentioned volatility, unfortunately, CalPERS is a larger discussion than we could get into here, but that's one of the things we're going to discuss as part of this long-range financial plan. But you know, just because CalPERS has changed the way that they set their annual required contribution, seeing volatility, in the annual costs. So that's something that we'll be talking a lot about.
Understand, maybe uncertainty is a better word than volatility, though.
Yeah. And I wanted to briefly touch on the comments on the SAP system. The version is going to no longer be supported. So we'll have a fork in the road of, do we upgrade SAP, which is quite an effort, or do we look at an alternative model? And we'll be doing a robust assessment in staff, and then we'll be bringing that to the board for discussion in terms of pro cons, costs, timing, and that sort of stuff going forward.
Yeah, I'm sure we're talking at least 10 million, huh? For that.
Yeah.
That's
I
the
don't know
numbers I
if we fully
understand.
have the costs, and to some extent it's dictated by which model we
There
go.
we go. Yeah.
It could get less expensive, like a lot of technology. But just to go back to the CalPERS thing and following up on Larry's comment, wouldn't it? And Chuck, we've discussed this before. Whether it wouldn't be more financially prudent to actually pay down some of our CalPERS unfunded, whatever you want to call it, outstanding pension costs, because CalPERS is kicking out a higher rate of interest than we're receiving on that reserve. So, if let's say CalPERS gives us 7%, we're earning 2%, that's going to chip away at that deficit more effectively than just socking money away for a rainy day.
Yeah, and again, Director Bragman, these are all things we'll be considering in the modeling, because CalPERS is a very big discussion. But you're right. I mean, I've been a big fan of actually chipping away at the I'm trying to think of a new term. I'll call it the UAL. I think it's wise to do that. You're right that our portfolio right now is earning about 1%. So you're definitely, you have an opportunity cost there where you can take that and throw it at a much more costly or higher return pension system. The problem is, though, and everything has two sides to it. You can take that money and throw it at PERS, but yeah, PERS has a target of 7% return. They don't always hit that return. So now when you pay more into PERS and you start chipping away at that UAL, you've got more money at risk with an entity that's investing in riskier assets, in equities and REITs and things like that. So there's a lot to go into the discussion with PERS, and usually you have to strike a balance of where the board is comfortable from a risk perspective of how much that we actually chip away at the UAL and how much we actually keep in reserves to address those future costs with PERS. The other thing is, and again, I don't want to get too far out in front of it, because again, this is part of the analysis we're doing. But what a lot of organizations are seeing also is that when you look at a long range view of PERS, you look out over a decade, you actually start to see those costs actually coming down, and those costs for most organizations are coming down within the next 5 years, because keep in mind that every new employee that we hire now is got a lower pension benefit than those of us that are what are called classic members. So those are actually bringing our costs down all the time as we start to introduce new employees into our district.
Yeah, I know, and I'll send it to you. I got a document from Fairfax. Fairfax is actually borrowing money to pay down its CalPERS pension deficit. So I meant to send that to you a couple of weeks ago, but it's just something you could take a look at for when we get into the discussion in more detail.
Pension obligation bonds, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Larry, a good thing to consider. I think one thing to keep in mind is that if you look at 1918, which I think is a pretty good model for 2019, that I think that the bulk of, from my research, the bulk of the roaring 20s and the increase in the stock market up through 1929 occurred because they people were just feeling good to get out of the pandemic. And I have a feeling we are looking at something similar in the roaring 2020s. So I think the issues about CalPERS may fade into the background. But one area that, and I don't know, Chuck, you're talking like there's an alternative to CalPERS. I didn't realize there was. So anyway, you can address that. But more importantly, the thing that really concerns me is I've been in the water business for 45 years. My father was in the water business for 30 years. So my entire life, 73, has been involved with water. And, you know, forever, the reserves were called drought reserves up until about 10 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago. And, you know, the purpose, we call it rate stabilization, but in reality, it's a drought reserve. I think we're running a little light on our reserves. We're at like 3 months. I would like to get a definitive decision and a board policy on what those reserves should be. The rule of thumb that we've been using is 6 months, but we don't ever seem to get there. So I think we need to reassess that whole area of reserves with a understanding that in order to fund them, we're going to have to put money away, which either means redirecting funds or increasing funding. So I think that really needs a thorough discussion of what the reserves should be, you know, because they serve so many functions, especially as the costs increase in the future. Having that money in the bank is worth an awful lot, in my opinion, to keeping things running in a smooth and easy manner.
If I may chime in here, this is a question, this is Steve from Raftellus. This is a question that we get a lot, so we're very prepared to help you on the reserve question. We've had quite a few other clients want to know what are other agencies doing for reserves, and we'll be able to help there and tell you what other agencies are doing.
Super.
Thanks. Can you tell us where to get the money to, Steve?
Could I just chime in, just sort of maybe a little off the wall, but I've raised this before, is whether we should talk to our investment advisor to see if there's any device we can use to refinance our bond debt obligation. I mean, we did pretty well when we did it, you know, a few months ago, but unexpectedly, interest rates have been cut in half. So we could save a lot of money if we could figure out a way to do that. So I know it's kind of a stretch, but that might be something to at least consider when we get into this deeper.
And Director Russell, we have working with our fiscal advisor on that. And the problem is that we don't have our 3 major bonds that are callable within before 2026, I think. So even if we were going to do an advance funding like we did, it would be some time before we could do that. But we may have opportunities, you know, if we look at other ways of financing projects that we prioritize as part of the process, we may be able to benefit from those lower rates.
Okay, I'm going to try and keep us moving a bit today.
I have one last question if I can.
Sure.
And it's a threshold question. As long as I've been on the board, we have been doing financial planning multiple times. In fact, I would say more board retreats than not have addressed a new idea of what we're going to be doing financial planning. And I don't mean to be creating a 3-hour-long answer to this question, but a threshold question is, obviously it sounds like an expensive, time-consuming process. Everybody's time would be involved in this. At the end of the day, when we have the financial plan, what will we have that we don't have right now?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. In my view, we'll have a foundation. Often what I've seen in agencies is your financial planning as part of the rate setting process. And that's very difficult to do. One, there's a bright light on it, and all the decisions and considerations are made through the lens of the rate increase that's coming in the next 3 months. The idea here is to take a step back. We're in the middle of a 4-year rate increase that the board has set, and allow us to look at relative priorities in a big picture, fairly holistic manner, to give staff a sense of the board's policy direction in terms of those priorities, and to design the rate setting process, a COSA process, in alignment with those priorities. So I don't believe, at least for some time, that we've had this sort of foundational document that guides those next steps.
We have not had that before, you're saying?
To my knowledge, at least for the last number of decades.
I think that's right, Jack. I think the way that Ben's describing it is correct, that when we've done our financial planning, it's almost been too late. It's been something we've talked about a fair amount, that we're doing it in the context of rate setting. And to build on Jack's, Jack, did you have something else you were going to ask before I jump in?
No, other than we have often done financial plannings in relation to rates, no question about that. But I think we have also done futuristic, looking forward financial plans aside from that. And I don't know what happened to those, or why are we doing it again? Yeah.
So that's anticipating my question. I think this is really more for staff than for Raftelis. And I'll just say personally, I'm so excited to have Raftelis on board. I work with Steve, I don't know you, but I do a lot of work with Melissa Elliott. So super delighted to have you guys working with us. It's just, I have a lot of confidence in you. So I'm so welcome, and I'm very pleased. So what I was going to say, what I would like to see staff do if they can, I think Jack raises an important question for those of us on the board. We have spent a lot of time on plans in the past, and I think it would be helpful for the board to have a summary, right? So let's just say the last 10, 15 years, like what have those plans been? What have the, and again, I'm looking for something at a high level. What have the projections been? What have those ambitions been? To what extent have we fulfilled those ambitions, and to what extent have we come up short? And if this is going to be a change in direction, I think we want to be hearing about that. Like what is the direction that we're looking for now? But I think for us to be making a rational set of decisions about where we want to go, we need to have a better sense about the results that those prior plans provided, and the extent to which they have benefited or not benefited the district.
Right.
So just to pause there, Ben, does that seem feasible to you?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great, will help put this in context and help guide us, because the last thing we want, and I appreciate the kind of pushback a bit on this, if maybe that's not the correct, precise term, but none of us want to spend the time and effort.
Right.
No, none of us want to spend the time and effort on this and just have a binder that sits on a shelf. We are committed to it being a very useful living foundational document. And just one quick kind of dive down in terms of capital, that's really, as we're looking at this, a dominant driver as we think long-term financial picture. We've really done a lot of early staff work in a way that we may not have done in the past. It looks at each of the 6 or 7 asset classes and what's best industry standard as we think about refurbishment of tanks on what cyclical basis. The same for pump stations, revisiting, and we've had discussions in the past certainly on miles per year of pipes, looking at the treatment plants, and then also looking at things like AMI, the SAP issue, that all compete for limited resources, and getting feedback. But I think those were 2 very good comments that give staff the sort of direction that we're looking for as part of today's discussion.
And let me make my position clear. I'm not saying I'm against this. And I'm certainly not saying we don't need a financial plan. I'm just saying it's not clear to me that we do and why we do.
Right.
So, and I will offer a friendly addition, if not an amendment. I am completely comfortable doing a financial plan. I'm making a different point, which is I want to have a summary for the board about what our prior plans have been, what they have and what they have not achieved. So I think that will help me and the rest of the board and the management and staff really frame where we are going forward. But I definitely do believe we need a financial plan going forward, because I don't feel like we have one that is responsive to the moment that we're in right now. So just to be clear, Jack and I are saying slightly different but complementary things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next set of questions I have, if we're done with that, to move on, I wanted to make a couple comments about Jeannie's presentation. I think it's really important. So first of all, I want to thank you for that, Jeannie. I think it's important to underscore the public outreach piece of this. I think as an institution, and I think, you know, we're not unusual in the water industry, we tend to put, you know, 90% of our effort into the engineering and the finances, and, you know, maybe 1 or 2% of our effort into communicating. So I would like to see that imbalance rectified. So I think this was a very good start. I think the idea that we're going to be doing this kind of public outreach, talking to the public beforehand, you know, along, I think that is essential. And the reason that I'm raising this is because we have a very unfortunate history of not preparing the ground the way we need to. We're always running behind. Oh, we're going to have a rate increase. Oh, we're doing this. Let's talk to the public. And by that time, it's far too late. So I really want to emphasize how important it is that we have the comms piece right up front, partnering with the financial analysis, you know, right from the beginning. So I just really want to provide my support for that. I think I heard quickly that Melissa Elliott's going to be involved in this. She's an enormous asset. So the more that I can be helpful in supporting those efforts and ensuring that we're putting real resources into that, and you know, really communicating to the maximum extent possible with the public about this, and in particular, local thought leaders. I think we have really lagged behind on bringing along people who help shape opinions locally. And I think that's where I'd want to see a lot of these efforts going.
Thank you. We completely agree, which is why we've structured the process like this, where Chuck and I are working side by side and in tandem, because we recognize the value and importance of that piece. Thank you for that.
Any other board comments or questions on this? Terry, do we have any public comments on this item? Can't hear you.
You're on mute, Terry.
Sorry, we do not have any comments.
Okay, we'll move into the next item on the agenda, which is the water system master plan. And I believe Lucy, I don't know, Mike, are you going to kick it off?
Yes, Ben, thank you. I'll kick it off this morning. So good morning, board. We are very pleased to present to you this morning the Water System Master Plan. The presentation will be led by Lucy Croy. This morning we're joined by Javier Arias, who's the project manager with Woodard & Curran, the consulting firm that is helping us prepare the master plan, as well as Alicia Irish with the district. I'm pleased to inform the board that Lucy was recently promoted from Senior Engineer Planning in the Engineering Department to Water Quality Manager in the Operations Department. She's filling the vacancy that was created earlier this year when Paul Sellier promoted to Operations Director. I'm also pleased to inform you that our new Senior Engineer in Planning is Alicia Irish. So in her new role, Alicia will be managing the planning department within the engineering division, and she will also be managing the water system master plan project going forward. So I want to thank Lucy for the outstanding job that she's done, not only managing the planning division here in the engineering department, but also with the water system master plan, and also wish her the best in her new role as the water quality manager with the district. So today, Lucy will be leading our presentation. Future presentations will be led by Alicia. So with that, I will turn the meeting over to Lucy.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, board. Lucy Croy. I'm pleased to be back in front of you presenting on the Water System Master Plan. This morning, I'll be giving an overview of the key elements of this project. This study will be identifying capital improvement needs within the system and opportunities for improvements. One example of which is up on the screen. This is Mill Valley Tank. This is a 5 million gallon welded steel tank that was built in 1967. Throughout its 53 years in service, it has not been recoded, which is far past the 20-year industry standard for recoding. In addition, it's oversized for the demand that feeds off this tank, and this really represents one of the opportunities of this study to evaluate our facilities that are no longer fully adequately meeting the functional needs of the district. And ultimately, we'll end up with a roadmap for sustainable rates of replacement and renewal that will improve the district's operations and maintenance of the system. Over the years, the district has undertaken numerous focused planning studies looking at the treatment plants in the water treatment plant master plan in 2015, the fire flow master plan in 96, and the follow-up in 2012, the improvement program, as well as the water resources plan 2040, looking at water supply. The water system master plan will be a comprehensive planning effort that will be evaluating capital infrastructure needs of the transmission system and the distribution system, including pipelines, storage tanks, pump stations. Through a comprehensive approach, the water system master plan will be developing a roadmap for investing in the water system of not only what needs replacing and rehabbing, but also at the right time, ensuring that a cost-efficient use of the district's limited resources occurs. With a mission of providing water to our customers reliably, maintaining our infrastructure is core to upholding that mission. Many of the assets that we have in our system are reaching the end of their useful life, and we need to start planning for investments that are cost-effective and will maintain reliable service into the future. Two of the assets that have already been identified as reaching the end of their useful life are Ross Reservoir and Pine Mountain Tunnel. These assets serve a significant portion of our district and will be a significant portion of the project dedicated to resolving the known storage issues in this system. This morning, I'll be stepping through each of the major tasks that make up this project, giving an overview of each. With the contract approved by the board last month with Woodard and Curran, the project team has already had a kickoff meeting and initiated work. The first major task that will set the foundation for the master plan is updating our planning and design criteria, which will be conducted this fall. Building off that task will be the overall system evaluation and Ross Valley evaluation that will occur next spring, culminating in a pre-design report that will be expected in July of 2021 for Ross Valley. In the second year of the project, we will have the updated criteria completed and system evaluations, and that will really lead the project into progressing into developing capital investment strategies that will be summarized in a water system master plan in July of 2022. As the first major task and deliverable of the master plan, the district's planning and design criteria will be reviewed and updated. Through multiple workshops with staff, the purpose of this task is really to arrive at criteria that is agreed upon early so that the system evaluations that follow later in the project reflect not only industry standards, but also criteria that's vetted by the district. The vetting process will take in consideration the trade-offs of cost, risk, and other factors. During this early phase of the project, we will also be conducting facility site visits and workshops with our operations group to ensure there is a good understanding of working system concerns as well. The main two types of planning criteria that will be considered and reviewed are scenario-based criteria and adequacy criteria. For scenario-based criteria, service levels under emergency planning scenarios, such as an earthquake, a power outage, wildfires, facility outages, will be developed and defined. One example that we have historically discussed internally is how to reliably provide water from two of our three main sources of supply, those being San Geronimo Treatment Plant, Von Tempe Treatment Plant, and Ignacio. And how would we do that under high summer demands over an extended period throughout the entire system? Under that scenario, there may be facilities that would not meet the criteria, and that would lead to recommended improvements in the system to meet that given level of service. The second criteria that I mentioned was adequacy criteria. This is the primary type of criteria that the district currently uses for sizing storage tanks and pumps. And this is typically a ratio of capacity to average day demand. Other adequacy planning criteria that we'll consider in this task is fire flow, max day demand, peaking factors, redundancy, backup power. And we expect that both of these types of criteria will be complementary to fully evaluate the system and identify deficiencies throughout. The project has been designed to provide a focused evaluation of Ross Valley system. And to do so, foundational of that is developing that planning and design criteria up front to really provide an equal footing for the overall system evaluation and the Ross Valley evaluation occurring in parallel. While developing the criteria, the goal is to really arrive at scenarios that are useful to the entire system and not just Ross Valley. And this will allow us to consistently evaluate in both the Ross Valley and the entire system. And it'll also allow us to lead to an accelerated deliverable by July 2021. Ross Valley is geographically a large part of our system. As shown here in the green, it serves about 23% of our system. And both of these assets that I've mentioned, Ross Reservoir and Pine Mountain Tunnel, are aging and undersized. And so we have developed a separate task dedicated to evaluating this system early in the project. The advantage of approaching this evaluation early and within the master plan is that we'll be able to look at the storage needs in Ross Valley in the context of the entire system using the planning and design criteria developed in the first phase of the project. The goal of this task will be to develop an approach to storage for Ross Valley that builds off prior work done over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And it evaluates new storage siting alternatives as well. The Ross Valley pre-design report that will be developed in this task will be instrumental in moving the district forward and in resolving storage issues in Ross Valley. The report will be a 10% design level effort, sufficient for informing the next steps, including CEQA and a more detailed design level work. And this will really significantly move the district towards replacing these two facilities. In tandem, the major elements of the distribution system, including pipelines, storage tanks, pump stations, and pressure regulating facilities, will be evaluated, again, using the planning and design criteria. This evaluation will lead to the identification of deficiencies and opportunities for improvement within the system to really maintain reliability of our infrastructure in the long term. One example that I've got up here is Sausalito Pump House, tank number 1 and tank number 2, all 3 are on the same facility site. And so, as an example, these 3 would be evaluated using the criteria to see if they meet the needs of the district at this point in time. A major outcome of the water system master plan is the development of long-term capital investment strategies that will outline renewal needs for various asset classes over the next few decades. This effort will take into account industry standards, useful life, timing of condition assessments, and levels of service. While there are many uncertainties when estimating renewal rates, these factors will help us develop appropriate investment levels without also disregarding the actual experience of how our assets are performing from our operators and our field crews. Also included in this task is the identification of near-term projects for high priority assets, and this will be blended into the long-term projected CIP strategy. The last and overarching task of reviewing the asset management program will be performed over the entirety of the project. The objective of this task is to provide recommendations to the district on cost-effective opportunities to improve the district's use of asset management practices so that we can really start making decisions that are increasingly risk-informed and data-informed on maintenance, replacement, and renewal of our infrastructure. Early on in the project, the district's pipeline risk model will be updated, including our likelihood of failure and consequence of failure criteria. And this will ultimately inform both the system evaluation and the capital investment strategies that are developed. The master plan will help build a framework for not only identifying a sustainable rate of renewal for the district's infrastructure, but refine how we also go about identifying high priority capital projects within our various asset and competing asset classes. Some of those that will be evaluated are storage tanks, pipeline replacements, pump station rehabs, and really what will be evaluated is what will have the greatest impact to our customers and how can we best use the district's resources. The water system master plan will conclude in a report summarizing each of the major milestones and tasks that I've covered, and a capital investment proposal that will be informing the long-term capital CIP. Over the next few months, as I mentioned, through this fall, staff will be reviewing and developing the planning and design criteria through workshops. We'll be conducting site visits to facilities alongside Woodard and Curran, and we'll be returning to give you a project update at the Operations Committee meeting, likely in December 2020. And I will take any questions at this time.
Well, I have essentially the same essentially the same question I had on the financial plan. Do we not now have a water system master plan, a roadmap for investing in the water system, et cetera? And if so, how will this be different? How is this improving what we already have?
We do not have one. The last master plan that was developed by the district is 1975, when the district was rapidly growing, which is typically when master plans are developed. So this will be a bit of a shift for us to focus on how do we maintain our infrastructure.
Is it a matter of bringing it up to date? Is that what we're doing? Or?
It's looking at our criteria. We have criteria that was, I think, developed probably in the 90s. And so this will be a matter of updating it to industry standards and working with our staff to make sure it aligns with their understanding of the system, and then using that criteria to really see what's deficient and what's okay within the system.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, Lucy. This is Larry. I see the absolute need for this document from a technical standpoint. You said several things, though, that caught me off guard. You thought that first tank was oversized. Are you worried about nitrification or something like that? I mean, I don't exactly understand how a reservoir can be oversized from a practical standpoint. You can always need more treated water, and you always have more need for fire protection. Are you talking about the drawdown is insufficient? And the next thing is, I was really surprised to hear you talk about a risk model. Are you talking about a statistical model that just looks at failures? Or do you actually envision something that is scientific, that looks at the materials and looks to predict failure?
So your first question is about Mill Valley Tank.
Yeah.
Based on our information from consumption data in 2012, we typically design our tanks right now for 2 times average summer day. That tank has over 9 times the amount of water that it should. for the demand that's downstream of it. So it turns over very rarely.
Yeah, couldn't you just lower the operating level
What
to
was
fix
that?
that? Couldn't you just lower the operating level to fix that?
You could, but you'd be maintaining a very large tank that also has not been recoated.
Right, but I mean, the cost of painting is less than the cost of replacement.
Right. We'd be looking at integrating this as part of the long-term strategy. There is a balance in water supply and water quality. As you look at sizing tanks, we have crews that go out routinely to add chlorine to a large number of tanks because their detention time is such that the chlorine gets exhausted. So, and we try to monitor, we have quite a number of tanks, but this is about trying to strike, when we talk about tank sizing, the right balance between water supply for consumption and fire and water quality. And it is a balancing effort. I don't know, Zav, do you have any thoughts on those questions?
Hello. Good morning. I'm President Gibson and members of the board. I'm really glad to be here, and we're looking forward to working on this project. To address the specific question that Director Russell had, I think what we saw at East Bay Mud, where I came from, I was the director of engineering there for many years. Frequently, we would look at a tank that was, as Lucy said, it's large from the point of view of greatly exceeding the normal metrics you'd use if you were sizing a new tank. Whether it should be recoated and left as it is or not depends usually on a lot of other facts. I mean, you look at, does it need replacing? And if so, maybe a smaller tank is the answer. And sometimes it turns out that two small tanks rather than one kind of medium to large tank is maybe it can be more expensive, but actually pose a lower O&M burden, because then when you can drain one completely, paint it, and then change and drain the other one, paint it, and so on. So you don't have an outage plan. There is no customer impact. So yeah, you need to look really at the full range. It might be keep what you got. It might be replace it with something smaller, or it might be actually split the storage. So I think it's a matter of case by case, but in general, we are sizing facilities smaller now. I mean, particularly for Marin, your demands are lower, and I think that's consistent with industry norms, but especially in Marin because of conservation. So that alone, since 1975, would warrant relooking at it. And I think there is also, since chloramines were introduced relatively recently, nitrification, which I heard that's a valid concern. So it used to be, well, just bigger is better. And if we have to add chlorine, we'll do that. And of course, the downside was THM, so that leads people to chloramination, which is good. But then water age still matters. So there's a lot of moving parts. I think it's worth looking at, hey, if this tank if it was sized in the era where bigger is better, well, maybe it is still better if all these other things can be addressed, like water quality and keep it cost effective and so on. So I hope that answers your question. There's a lot of pieces to look at.
Yeah, there are, but and we've done a fair amount of work for East Bay Mud on nitrification, so I find that interesting too, dead end issues. But you know, in Mill Valley, it's going to take a lot to pry me off of having a big tank for fire protection because of the potential demands and the danger in Mill Valley. I mean, Mill Valley is a carbon copy of the Oakland fire that East Bay Mud experienced. It's exactly the same kind of thing. Roads are too narrow, fire trucks can't get through, and the potential for demand is huge. But the other thing is, I'm sure you're aware of all this, but LA Water and Power has been doing that work with the ultraviolet lights in the tanks to address the nitrification issue. And that to me looks like the best solution that I've seen for this issue, is to go ahead and put the UV in the tanks. And rather than trying to rechlorinate, you know, you get in a little tricky area there, the 0.2 parts per million and all that. But I would doubt that if we put in the UV lights that we would have problem with chloramine residual, because I think you'd wipe out the bugs and then you wouldn't have the problem of the other issues. Now, I have no idea what that UV does to the interior coating, because if it's strong enough to get the bugs, it's probably strong enough to attack the coating. So that's an area. Obviously, interior coatings were never intended for ultraviolet exposure. So that's a whole area that has to be looked at. But like I say, I have real resistance to, I mean, if the tank is decrepit, that's a different issue. If it just hasn't been coated, you know, it probably speaks to the fact that the coating there is pretty good, that if it's held up for 50 years or whatever the time is. So anyway, you know, we look forward to your input on that area.
Thank you.
Your second question was on our risk model.
Yeah.
We've done two efforts. We've done a pilot study looking at a machine learning risk model for likelihood of failure. And then we also have a model that's done preliminary looking at both likelihood of failure and consequence of failure using factors such as break history, material type, diameter, and then also for consequence, you know, where is it located? Is it near a creek, et cetera?
Good, good. I'm glad to hear that. So it's basically statistics. I mean, you have a little bit on material, but the thing that I think that we're missing the boat on, though, is that, at least potentially, is it seems to me, and I've asked this question numerous times over the last 20 years, should we be accelerating the replacement of the kinds of pipes that are causing us problems? And I mean that we currently have a program, as I understand it, that replaces on about 1 in 100-year life. So 1% per year, something to that effect. And I've asked the question over and over again, should we be looking at a 5% in 1 year instead of 1% in 5 years? Because if there's particular pipes that are a problem, and we know there's problems with the cast iron pipes, for instance, should we be looking at those harder to say those got to go quicker? And you know, I understand the logic of the slower methodical approach, but I mean, I forget the one that's recent, but there was one that had like 8 or 12 brakes on it that we're currently changing, as I recall, in the Southern Marin replacement program. You know, that's a lot of brakes on a pipe.
And if I could chime in on that, it's a question I think all owners wrestle with, you know, because you're always trying to figure out if you knew the day before a pipe broke, that'd be the first, I mean, the best case is you go out there and replace it then. But until then, it's a combination of models. I think Lucy talked about a couple different approaches. And I know you've tried the Fracta model, which actually tries to look at things like pipeline material and make testable predictions about what's going to happen. So it's more quantitative rather than the relative scale of the likelihood and consequence model. And I think it's certainly worth looking at. It is the holy grail would be you could make great predictions, and it might tell you that you should go replace a whole class of pipe in an accelerated fashion if you had high confidence in it. It turns out so far, I think that holy grail is still being pursued. You know, that we did a head-to-head between the kind of COF, LOF, and Fracta at East Bay Mud. In fact, we were their first customer. So they did a lot of their development back before they were even called Fracta, using our system at East Bay Mud. So what we got was a great chance to do testable side-by-side. Well, what if we do business as usual? Let's evaluate all those pipes. What would we replace according to that method? What is Fracta telling us we ought to replace? And then usually it'd be sort of like going to two different doctors and deciding, well, what should my medical plan be? You might in some cases go with Dr. A and sometimes Dr. B, but one way or the other, a decision's made and certain pipes are slated for replacement. And then you get to see, usually before those pipes actually get replaced, you get to see what happened after you decided. So that was done pretty systematically. There's a great presentation on it, but the bottom line is Fracta, it's a great idea, but it's trying to use all the things like material and age and proximity to transit, everything, phases of the moon in theory. But it turns out it's slightly is beat by the traditional COF LOF. Fracta might be able to predict first failure, which COF, LOF methods would really never do. But on the whole, as far as, well, did it generally pick which pipes are going to be bad actors if we leave them alone? And it turns out that the basic method of observe the pipe and pay attention to things like consequence, so you don't, flood a critical business district or whatever. But that actually works at least as well as what would appear to be more sophisticated models. So I think first we have to just recognize that there's always going to be some uncertainty. I think an insight we got from doing all of that is really important also, that it's really the very worst of the absolute worst pipes that are dominating all of your repairs and future, call it liability, risk of severe consequences because something goes wrong. So I'm not convinced yet that we would jump all the way to 5. In fact, it's more about if you could actually pinpoint the very worst pipes, and even if they're expensive to replace, go do that. And I think that's easier said than done. But if you could identify the worst 0.5% of your pipes and go do them on a high priority basis, even if they cost $1,000 a foot to do instead of $400 a foot, those would be the ones. So it might not be about miles of pipe is really what it amounts to. It is certainly a nice dashboard indicator. Are you more or less on track with a sustainable footing? Got to keep that in mind. But sometimes it means, the right thing might be tackle some really nasty pipes that are going to look, your metrics might look bad because, you might spend millions on a short piece of pipe. But if it's the pipe that's going underneath the freeway, that will be a nightmare when it breaks. And that's the right pipe to do. And I know you have one of those, by the way.
Yeah, that's a great discussion. I really appreciate that. I like your thinking. You're directly on the way I would approach it. And I think that the emphasis needs to be put where the problem is first, as opposed to a routine replacement. The other thing I'd like you guys to think about is the difference in our system that results from using things like PVC. We're casually tossing around numbers of 100-year life. It seems to me that PVC and cathodically protected welded steel have life that's potentially a lot longer than 100 years. And I'd like you guys to give some thought to that issue. The other thing I'd like to say on Lucy's end is, it seems to me that it would be highly beneficial to conduct, having worked in the water business for my entire life, I understand the value of seeing it with your own eyes, sort of. But under the conditions we're operating in, and I think in the change into the 21st century, I think you should give some serious thought to using a video that documents the stuff in the field for 2 reasons. One, I really doubt there's a whole lot of benefit to dragging 10 people out to look at a tank. But more importantly, it documents it forever. And it captures the information in a way, and this comes back to Jeannie, maybe we could really improve our video memory of the water system by using an intuitive video that looks at certain things and captures that information. You guys could set up a list of what you want captured, whether it's control systems or pump age or pump orientation or motor size or motor type or efficiency or whatever you wanted. But that stuff could be captured in a video. So it's just a thought, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Thank you.
Okay, Lucy, I got just one short one for you. I think I thought I heard in your presentation, and I may have misheard, but that part of it was an evaluation of some new storage sites, which if so, I presume would be tanks. That I just want to focus on the fact that whenever we've done it in the past generates a significant amount of public involvement and public input. So.
Yes, we basically want to make sure that we're not leaving anything unturned at this point, is more than anything what we're trying to capture. And there is a significant amount of public involvement that is included in the scope of work as we move forward with the Ross Valley evaluation.
On the Ross Valley evaluation, we did do a pretty extensive review of that a few years ago, and did tentatively agree on a preliminary plan to put a new tank at the Ross Reservoir site, and kind of put the Five Corners tank on hold. And I know I've talked to Ben about it, and you know, I appreciate that it's a priority right now, because it's been an issue for quite some time, and I believe actually the Marin Grand Jury actually mentioned it in one of their reports because of the fire, the need for water if there was a wildfire event. But we did do some reports back in 2016, I believe. And I hope as part of the plan, we're going to do some kind of, you know, review of those documents. And I think it would be helpful for me, at least, to be able to look at the sort of progression of documentation, because this has been going on for, you know, a number of years, as I'm sure most of the other board members are aware. Then the other thing I just wanted to bring up, and this is just an engineering question, is whether any of that excess capacity from Mill Valley could be used in other areas. In other words, if we had a fire event, a wildfire event, let's say in Ross Valley, could that excess capacity in Mill Valley just be pumped into that area and used for wildfire, you know, wildfire fighting? So in other words, that there is some, you know, as Larry Russell mentioned, you know, there is kind of this, I don't know, inherent benefit of having storage.
Mm-hmm. So your first comment on background information, Zav can attest that we are handing off a significant portion of background information. We have inundated Wood and Kern at this point. There's a task 0 that I did not mention, but we will have everything available. And that is a significant part of this project, is really sorting through all the work that has already been done so that they build off of it rather than recreating. And then as far as Mill Valley goes, I didn't really finish, I think, fully answering the question, which is that, you know, under our current standards, I would say it's not meeting our criteria, but that is exactly what this study is about, is looking at it using the scenario-based criteria and new criteria that is adequacy, and making sure that, you know, the size of it is what's needed, given its different scenarios. So we will see under this study whether the size is adequate for our system. But under our current situation, using the criteria that we have, we would call it not adequate, especially due to the water quality issues that we have. Zav, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
I think you summarized it pretty well. I've certainly, at least, I've read hundreds of pages of all the different studies, and they do go back actually longer than 20 years. I think people have looked for storage and where might we put it, and actually where should we put it to provide the best fallback capability, so that, you know, if you had something like a fire and a power outage and all that, you could reach the greatest number of potential places. So I certainly have, I've reviewed a lot of the information, and I think there's a whole other delivery that's coming from Lucy and Alicia. So I'm looking forward to that. I guess in short, we do intend to build on all the great work that's been done, not reinvent the wheel.
Good.
But I think it's important to look at the updated criteria, because we do want to take advantage if there's reduction in demand. Also make sure we understand what we're getting into for level of service, so that we can, you know, deliver on a promised level of service, but not overbuild if we don't have to.
Right, right. And I think if you look at the evolution of the Ross Valley plan, you'll see that it's kind of gotten a little smaller because of the decrease in the demand. So
yes,
yeah. Okay, looking forward to it.
Okay, a couple of quick questions if I can. Lucy, some of my overarching question is for you, but also more broadly in the way that we're approaching this long-term planning. And that is that I see that water efficiency is sort of called out as its own thing at the end of our agenda today. And I'd like to suggest that the management and staff expand their thinking about this somewhat. For a while now, some of us, I guess primarily me, but I think others, have been talking about really rethinking the way that we envision efficiency. And specifically, I'd like to recommend, and I'd like to see you re-envision it as part of supply, right? Water use efficiency is more and more, well, country nationwide, as all of you are aware, more and more water utilities are recognizing that it is the cheapest source of supply, almost everywhere. And not every form of efficiency, but many of them. So what I would like to see us do is moving in the direction of not envisioning efficiency as its own separate thing over here, but as an integral part of the water system and an integral piece of infrastructure, whether or not it's conventional. So all of the infrastructure here is enormously important. We have to deal with all of these things, but we can also begin to think about infrastructure in a much broader, more inclusive way to include these decentralized distributed systems, which in the long term are going to do an enormous amount to build our resilience to climate change, to keep our rates affordable, and generate any number of other benefits to the community. So as you're going forward with the water system master plan, I'd like to see particularly decentralized infrastructure, water efficiency measures included in this as part of the water system. And I'd like to see how that's going to be included into our capital planning. I know we've talked about this a lot, but I'm still not seeing recognition that we are now in a situation where we can capitalize those investments, specifically investments in consumer facing incentives, which we're going to need if we're going to be really upscaling efficiency in a big way. So I'm going to return to this theme as we go down this list. When we get to long-term water supply, drought planning, sustainability, in each of these places, I'm going to want to see how this district is stepping up to see water use efficiency, not as like, here's this other thing we're doing over here after everything else, but integrating this into our long-term planning for infrastructure investment and spending and becoming a much more central piece of our resilience planning going forward.
Thank you. We will incorporate.
I'd like to add one more thing, Lucy. I think being that we finally put in the generation capacity to have standby, I think that needs to be ground into the thinking too about what happens with storage and the appropriate sizing, because that's something that's completely new in this year or in the last 24 months. So that's a change the district never had before, at least not in a systematic way. So that needs to be pushed into the thinking as well.
Just to go back to my point, which just got run over, I'd like to hear staff respond to some of that. I just don't want to let it go by. I've raised this numerous times. It does not show up. It continues to not show up. And I'd like to hear how that is going to begin to show up in these planning and financial documents.
If we could let staff take that question, we do hear it and think about it. To be frank, the scope of this particular project was intended to look at the traditional infrastructure and begin to think about the investment deficit that we have among all these different asset classes. But we will huddle and be able to respond in an appropriate way to your comments and interests.
Right, and I want to emphasize that I don't see these as either or things. They need to be both and, because we're talking about a 10-year plan. And if there's one thing I think we can probably all agree about is there is no 10-year plan that does not include very significant upscaling of our investment in decentralized water use efficiency if we are to be more resilient to drought and to the various other kinds of disruptions that we've seen. So if there's, maybe we need to start there with a conversation about that. But I think for far too long, we have sort of put this off as if it's some sort of luxury item, something that really is not significant and isn't going to provide real benefits. I think the experience that we've had over the 15 years that Larry Russell and I have been on the board is exactly the opposite. We were looking at, let me remind all of you, because some of you were here and some of you were not, we were looking at spending well over $100 million in capital on a desalination facility, plus another $5 to $6 million annually in operating costs for a desal facility, which was absolutely required to get us to the projected level of consumption that we were supposed to see by 2030. Well, we've basically conserved our way into a new reservoir. At that time, we were at 30,000 acre feet. I think we're now at whatever, in annual demand, I think now we're at what, 23, 22, something like that. And that is through a very, very modest investment, primarily in toilets and some washing machines, which were never capitalized. That all just came out of grants and operating funds. If we were to get serious about treating water use efficiency as the infrastructure investments, as the water system investments they need to be, there is real question in my mind about the extent to which some of the other investments we're talking about here are even necessary. And we can't get to that. The board can't get to that clear decision-making if the management and staff are still continuing to put that success as if it's some sort of aberration. To me, that is the single most important, most salient feature of what's happened with this water district and supply in the last 15 years. So I am concerned that we're seeing this level of, planning and organization and, vision, and we're still, nevertheless, taking our cheapest, our most reliable, our most resilient source of supply and treating it, as something we're going to continue to keep on the margins. So I think that's a big part of our outreach to our community. I think it's enormously important for our, our safety and our resilience going forward.
Well said.
Any other board comments on this item? Terry, do we have any public comments?
Yes, we do have one, Larry Minikes.
Yes, good morning all. Cynthia, excellent comments on the financial plan, the master plan. I read this very carefully last night, and I'm really impressed with the amount of thought that is going into this, and there is a real need for it. And I wrote down 3 words, and I'm just going to say them right now. Preparedness is everything, and we've seen what's happened elsewhere, and I'm speaking to the choir, and these are the kind of things that we really need at this point. And with that, that is my comment. Thank you so much.
I do not have any more.
Okay, with that, we'll move on to the third item we have today, which is the watershed recreation plan. We're struggling with the right name, but we'll land on it once we get it going. And Sean, you're going to roll through that for us.
That's right. Good morning, board members. Sean Horn, Watershed Resource Manager. I'm going to share my screen and bring up a presentation that we're going to give you on watershed recreation planning this morning. So we all really appreciate and value the fact that the watershed lands of the district is charged with stewarding, support a rich array of plants, animals, and an exceptional panoramic vistas and recreational opportunities that are treasured by community members, visitors from throughout the Bay Area, throughout the state, throughout the nation, throughout the world. And this is really what we're here to talk about, because as we've seen throughout a number of years with increases in recreation occurring on busy weekends, holidays, throughout the week, and now with COVID and shelter in place, recreational use going above and beyond what we've ever seen before, and really coming to overwhelm some of our recreational facilities in some ways, some of our popular trails, some of the major entry points. So this is really what we're talking about when we're thinking about recreation planning on the watershed. And the presentation that we put together for you this morning is really going to review some of the existing plans that we have in place that give us the foundation to manage the watershed lands, and then speak just very briefly to some of the gaps that are within those plans that we'd be looking to fill through this recreation planning process. And then kind of go over what the purpose of the planning is, the planning background, what are we going to be getting out of it, and then move into kind of a framework for this, and then very briefly just what an outline at this point looks like, and that would be the outline for the plan. And this is preliminary, so we do expect that through conversations this will continue to expand. And then we'll outline kind of a schedule for this proposed planning process. So this will be a review for all of us. The water district has a number of existing plans that really allow us to maintain the watershed. One of the most foundational in regards to recreation is our Mountain Tams Roads and Trails Management Plan, which was adopted in 2005. This really gives us the tools to carry out maintenance of our road infrastructure as well as our trails to protect water quality and the sensitive resources that are on the watershed. This really outlines a process for the district to continue to maintain it. It gives us the environmental clearance and foundation to get the permits we need to construct some of our culverts and other infrastructure on the watershed. And it's really critical to our operations. However, it doesn't lean into the question about how do we manage recreational use and the users that are coming to visit the watershed. So then we also have the Biodiversity, Fires, and Fuels Integrated Plan, which the district adopted in October of 2019. This really gives us the management actions that we can carry out and the monitoring efforts and inventories that we'll conduct to inform our vegetation management to reduce the risk of wildfire and fuels on the watershed, as well as enhance some of the ecological functions and biodiversity that we see. This is really critical and allows us to carry out maintenance in the form of roadside brushing and fuel break maintenance, which are critical to ensure that we have access to our facilities, we have emergency response abilities, and then we also have appropriate space to allow for recreation through the watershed, through vegetation management of our roads, as well as our trails. In 2013, the district, recognizing an increase in watershed use generally, pursued a watershed census study. And this was really critical because it gave us kind of our first look and focused effort at looking at the different users and what past recreational activities are going on, where are those major entry points, and what number of visitors are we seeing on an annual basis. And what this study really found was that at that time, we were seeing approximately 1.8 million visitors. And I think what we need to think about in regards to those visitors, some of those being repeating visitors, some of those being visitors from out of town, but really that means almost 2 million boots, running shoes, bicycle tires, or hoofs on the watershed, moving across and through. And that does create wear on our resources and our facilities, and we need to think about how to manage that. In addition, the district gets a lot of support from our collaborations with OneTam. There's the Peak Health Report, which really brought together data from all the different land management agencies to inform kind of what is the state of the mountain. And this is in the process of being updated, but provides us a really good insight for what our resources look like, how they're doing, and what potential impacts are occurring to those resources and need where focused management should be occurring to help mitigate those potential impacts. And then also the OneTam annual work plan. This really outlines the activities that we partner with the OneTam collaboration on to bring forward environmental stewardship opportunities, environmental education, and also bolsters some of our management programs in the form of invasive species management, as well as doing focused studies such as the forest health study that's going on right now, or the countywide vegetation mapping endeavor. So we also have a Lagunitas Creek Stewardship Plan, which really outlines the district's operations in regards to enhancing habitat and resources and monitoring fisheries within the Lagunitas Creek area and watershed, and really focuses on our stewardship of those resources. So what all of these plans give us is kind of a foundation for our management. However, they don't lean into the question of how do we really manage with recreation in mind, with a focus on our facilities that support those different user groups and those different users group specific goals on the watershed. And so that's what we're talking about today, is really how do we start to look at supporting users in a more meaningful way to ensure that everyone has the opportunity that they're looking for when they're visiting the watershed. So starting with why plan for recreation? Well, as recreation use increases, so do competing land uses, ecological and cultural effects, as well as safety concerns. This really leads for a demand for us to think about how do we continue to protect the watershed's biodiversity, water quality, and environment as a whole in regards to recreation. How do we sustain safe, inclusive access to recreational opportunities for diverse user groups? How do we continue to bolster our efforts to address unauthorized use? And then how do we expand our outreach programs, our education, really with a focus on building a culture that respects the natural resources and the stewardship efforts that the district is trying to put forward within the context of recreation. And then ensuring that the district has adequate capacity to maintain its infrastructure, historical assets, landmarks, and preserve its natural resources while ensuring public safety. And I think this is a critical part to the planning endeavor. Our BIFIP does a very good job of outlining management actions that are critical and how we're going to complete those. However, the district's plans that we currently have take a number of resources financially and staff-wise, and as we look towards recreation planning and bolstering our support for it, we also have to look at how we can continue to support the new programs and initiatives that we're putting forward. So the purpose of this is really to guide operations and public access to district's watershed lands in a coordinated manner that proactively addresses water quality and biodiversity. And I think it's important that we should acknowledge that the district has done a great job of developing a number of programs throughout the years, whether it be our sign management program that our rangers oversee, where we do provide kind of updates and information about our regulations. But as we know, signs go only so far, and some of our signs could be refreshed to kind of remind and reinstate the facts that we do have some guidelines for people recreating on the watershed. Our watershed maintenance group does a great job of maintaining our roads and trails network. However, we could be expanding that maintenance in a way that ensures that our facilities are the useful life of our facilities is expanded. We do have trail volunteer opportunities, and we do use a limited number of contractors to support our trail maintenance work. However, we could be expanding this in a more targeted way to have a number of kind of defined metrics around number of linear trail miles that we complete each year to really maintain and support recreation on those single track trails as well as on our fire road systems. We have a robust biological monitoring data set, whether it's plants or animals or birds, and we could use that information to really inform our Project Restore efforts, which is closure of our non-system trails. So looking at how we can leverage that information to inform our management. And then we have exceptional outreach efforts. Slow and Say Hello has been a really strong program that's been developed over the years, and we can't say enough about what it's bringing to the district. But currently, or historically, we were doing 2 to 3 events annually. We've ramped that up to be 6 events annually on the watershed, but as we know, that's not enough to really influence culture over time. So as part of the COVID response and mitigation processes that we've gone through, we've expanded our Watershed Ambassador program to a greeters program. We're doing that 2 days a week, and to move that forward into the future, we will need to think about how we support that from a capacity standpoint. And that's kind of a tool for really getting to that cultural development of our recreational users. So what's the objective of a recreation planning process? It's really to establish a sustainable foundation for watershed access that supports and welcomes people of all cultures, communities, and abilities from throughout the region with a variety of opportunities to enjoy nature. It really focuses and will be built around continuing to protect our water quality, our wildlife habitat for future generations of plants and animals and people. And then enhance our community's identity and connection to the district's watershed lands, its history, and the fact that it's our local water supply, which is very unique for California. And then provide a long-term vision for how we maintain watershed facilities and adapt our operations to ensure safe and inclusive access to the watershed. And really all of this has to be thought about within the context of how do we sustain adequate program capacity for effective outreach, enforcement, and stewardship that really allows this to be a successful planning endeavor and long-term framework. So what does the framework for this effort look like? Really, it starts with a fairly aspirational component, which is to define what sustainable recreation is for the district's watershed lands. Fairly new thinking around how do we do this, or how do you define what sustainable recreation is? And this will take a lot of work and outreach to the community to bring together discussion from a variety of groups who have perhaps different goals for recreating, and how to define what the long-term vision for sustainable use is for the district, which will mean balancing different uses. And then really developing a long-term vision for how we achieve those desired conditions to guide our recreation management actions. And then identify a recreation monitoring approach to inform adaptive management. One of the things that the 2013 census study, it really gave us a look at what's going on in the watershed, and we should be thinking about, how frequently should we be revisiting this type of study? And are there monitoring endeavors that we can be carrying out in between those updates to ensure that we understand the changes in use that are going on, and we can adapt our management accordingly. And then also, we have a robust database of our infrastructure and facilities, but we can do kind of catalog and prioritization of future improvements that will support additional users and specifically the needs that different user groups have. While we're looking at this, we'll be looking in a very meaningful way at how we protect our natural resources and provide restorative operations. And really that's how do we scale up our Project Restore activities. We have as many non-system trails as we have system trails in the watershed. And there's some thought that could go into how do we prioritize closure or how do we kind of realign the systems to support the users in a new way. Expand our community partnerships. This really comes back to some of the discussions we've been having with our e-bike community advisory committee and some of the public outreach efforts is really how do we start to influence culture on the watershed? And this has to occur through a focused public outreach endeavor that really comes from the district and partners with existing groups. And we can expand upon that through developing some focused efforts under this planning framework. And then evaluate and adapt our enforcement strategies. We have robust regulations. We're not looking at revising all of those regulations here, but we do recognize that enforcement is going to be an ongoing thing to look at and consider as we think about planning for recreation. And then, as I mentioned before, considering watershed funding, staffing, and programs, and the existing resources really needs to be thought about when we're considering recreation and new initiatives on the watershed. So to summarize that into kind of our preliminary outline for what this plan would look like, it would really start with an introduction and defining what sustainable use for the district's watershed lands are, and then come up with a framework and long-term monitoring approach for looking at recreation and adapting management accordingly. And then an assessment of our existing recreational facilities and structures, as well as our historical structures of significance and resources, to look at how we can continue to improve upon our facilities and maintain those facilities to support those different user groups that we see. And then looking at how we can continue to prioritize and enhance the natural resource and assets throughout the watershed. So then there would be a section on bolstering our community partnerships and the engagement processes that we're working on. And that would really be focused on kind of targeting new partnerships with groups that haven't been as engaged in our stewardship and outreach endeavors. So the final or next section would really be management actions to achieve those desired conditions. And this is really critical, coming up with some metrics for management that we're looking to implement each year and would guide kind of our long-term vision to establish kind of sustainable access. And then an assessment of watershed resource capacity, just looking at how we can kind of bolster and support the community through our programs in a way that is sustainable over time. So the next steps for this, and we've started this first one, is reviewing other agencies' management plans. And I think the thing that we need to acknowledge here is that the district is very unique in being it's a water district that provides recreational access. There's not a lot of other examples of agencies that have as much opportunity for recreation as we do, coming from the water municipal perspective. So we do have to kind of hybridize a lot of different plans to come up with what the framework for our recreation planning process would be. And then we develop a request for solicitations and bring on some supporting consultants to help us develop this plan, and then go through a robust public engagement process before we start developing any component of the plan to really work with the community to come up with the vision for those desired conditions and defining what sustainable access is. And then hopefully, if all goes well, we'd be looking to present a draft plan to the board in January or February of next year. So with that, I will take any questions that you might have regarding this recreation planning proposal and process that we're looking at, and any thoughts about things that we should be considering as we move forward.
I actually just have a comment, Sean. First of all, congratulations. You've deprived me of my threshold question. You made it very clear what we've done before here and why this is new and what's needed. So thank you for that.
Again, Sean, another great presentation. I suppose it was woven into your presentation, but it seems to me that one of the things that you didn't mention was staffing. And that seems to be one of the critical areas that I think in general, the users or the perceived users of the watershed feel we're understaffed in the watershed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something that really needs to get thought through. It's probably a subsidiary of what you're talking about, but it's definitely in there. Enforcement is definitely an issue. I have had users report to me about the frequency of nighttime use of the watershed. I spoke to Ben about it. It's supposed to be closed at night, and yet apparently there's quite an active set of users at night. And I think we need to address it. I can't envision any manner in which it's safe to be on the watershed at night. So especially on a bicycle or something to that effect. The other thing is, I think we seriously have to look at things like bicycle licensing and using potentially the funding from that for the staffing. So those are just some thoughts that have come across as I prepare for an election in 40 days.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I would just say that, you know, I did generalize in my discussion that resource capacity is really what we're talking about there, is the financial resources to carry out new programs, as well as the staffing resources to support those programs.
Cool. Sorry, a little over my head.
Any other board comments on this?
All right.
I think Larry was muted.
Sorry. Did staff get a proposal by Sherwood consultancy? A friend of mine, Warren Karlinzig, actually sent it to me, but it addresses some of the trail erosion and runoff design issues that that Sean was addressing in his presentation. So I don't know. I was just looking at it. It's pretty interesting.
Yes, Larry, we did get a proposal from them back in July, and they will be certainly considered as we'll inform them of the solicitation for proposals.
Okay, good. You know, as far as night riding, there's definitely a lot of night riding. You know, there's organized rides coming out of Fairfax. So, and it's not just a safety issue, really. It's an issue really for the health of the watershed. You know, I don't really think it's great for the animals to have bikes with lights ripping down roads at night when most of the animals are most active at night. So, you know, it's definitely an issue, and I guess we'll get into it further. I don't want to get into the weeds too much right now, but you know, maybe technology, you know, could be our friend with some additional cameras and that type of thing. Bike licensing, possible, definitely, especially with e-bikes. We're not going to be able to control which class of e-bikes are going to be permitted unless we have some kind of licensing or registration program. So I think that should definitely remain on the table. So yeah, and thank you for the presentation. It was excellent.
Okay, Terry, do we have any public comments if there's no more?
Yes, we have 3 comments. The first one is from Monty Schmidt.
Hi, folks. Monty Schmidt. I'm a candidate for the Water Board this November. And thank you, Sean, and thank you all. You know, everybody who's done a lot of preparation for the meeting today. It's extremely informative, and I hope that more of the citizens of Marin are tuning in, because a lot of folks, I think, have a lot of questions about this, the work and the discussions that are going on here, and it's super helpful to make this available. Questions about our resource management. A couple part questions, and feel free, Sean, to take these in parts. My first question is really about coordinating this plan with other partners in the watershed, like One TAM. You know, the boundaries of the district butt up against other resource management agencies, and people cross those lines. You know, this really is kind of one big watershed, though obviously the responsibilities on MMWD land are different and are managed differently. I'm wondering to what extent this recreational planning effort will link with those others. And a question about cost sharing, because again, the benefits go across boundaries, and so is that open up the door for cost sharing. And sort of relatedly, and I'll come back if you need me to break this back down again, is, to the extent that MMWD or a larger partnership can be accessing funding from grants to help cover these costs instead of looking to our budget and that's fed by our rates. Thanks.
Yeah. Ben, do you want us to answer all the questions?
Yeah, I think in a workshop like this, we can go ahead. We have time. Thanks.
Okay,
thank you.
So absolutely. So through our e-bike public review process that we're going through right now, we're doing public outreach. Part of that public outreach is to coordinate with all the land management agencies. So we're coordinating a meeting to talk about just that cross-jurisdictional element of recreation. So we would be looking to do the same through the public process for the recreation planning plan. As we move forward, we'd be coordinating with each of the individual agencies as a group to talk through kind of how recreation planning could link up to those existing programs. And one area that we could think a lot about and build upon really would be OneTAM spearheading this new trail maintenance crew and group. And so thinking about how we can kind of leverage the resources that they're bringing to the table, and also look kind of across the landscape as a whole about how we can do coordinated projects that could be grant funded and really show that collaboration through the region. So that kind of goes to, yes, we will be coordinating with OneTAM and connecting to their plans, using some of their data as baselines for the foundation of this planning process. Cost sharing, there may be opportunities. We do support some of the work on other lands, and we get resources from some of our other agencies in different ways. I think the cost sharing would likely come in the form of partnerships for grants. And we'd probably be looking for, kind of bolstering our multi-jurisdictional land management approach for recreation to be more competitive within that grant arrangement.
Terry?
Great, thank you.
Yes, thanks. The next speaker we have is Roger Roberts.
Sean, does your planning process include identification of special endangered resources and species that exist on the watershed, to the extent of perhaps highlighting those to change alignment of trails, to limit recreation opportunities into areas which really should be classified as wilderness areas, where no one should be riding bicycles or treading on resources that are truly endangered?
Yeah, thank you, Roger. Appreciate the question. Absolutely. One of the areas in the write-up that we provided as part of this board packet is on the natural resources and restorative operations that we're thinking about. And that's really about how we can use our robust data sets for the biological resources on the mountain to inform our Project Restore activities. So specifically, how can we prioritize closing and restoring some of the areas that are currently non-system trail routes to protect and preserve some of those sensitive resources. But then we're also proposing to look one step further and actually discuss the potential establishment of ecological conservation areas that would be closed to use. So one of the things as we do Azalea Hill Trail Project, we are going to be closing and signing some areas as closed where there are non-system trails so that we can enforce that closure. And that's a really critical and key component. So it's thinking about where our sensitive resources are on the watershed. There are zones that are closed to that don't have existing trails now that have sensitive resources that we could potentially be signing as closed to ensure that people aren't, as you mentioned, trampling through those areas.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Larry Minikis.
Thank you. Sean, great presentation. I also want to thank you for your presentation yesterday to OneTAM. you and Mike and such, those were outstanding presentations to the public, and they need to hear these kind of things. So it's really appreciated. You know, sustainable recreation is really the key here. And I'm what you call an evening user, meaning that I'm usually coming off the watershed at sunset around that time. So I'm seeing a lot of what's going on. And there are some alarming things going on. There's been changes since really February, March with COVID. Mountain bike use has grown. Recreational use, as you know, has increased substantially. And even to a non-professional like myself, I'm seeing far more resource wear and tear than I've ever seen in a short period of time in a lot of areas, in a lot of ways too. It's just accelerating, and it's really, I think we'll be back here in 4 or 5 years talking about how much more damage we're seeing to this watershed, because it's really now become a recreational park equal to what it's supposed to do as a watershed for us. There are a few concerns. One, with e-bikes, I'm seeing far more e-bikes than I've ever seen. And particularly during the summer, they've grown substantially. And the problem I'm seeing is that these guys, women, have very bright lights on them, brighter than you see on normal bikes. And I'm seeing far more e-bikers in the evenings than regular bikers heading up the mountain as I'm heading down. There's a lot of them coming out now. Another thing that's occurring are these music boxes, these very compact boom box things. There's so much more noise up there now. There are so many more people playing music out loud, and it's really disturbing. It's disturbing for animals. It's disturbing for other users. Evening use is, as Larry was saying, is a real concern for animals. It's very disturbing. It's the only time they really have to go out and feed. And that causes the other problem there. You know, I think I'll leave it at that, because it says what needs to be said, is that the culture has changed, the use of the resources changed these months, and even the work that the e-bike committee did last year in some ways is negated, some of it, because so much has changed in terms of how fast all of this is growing out there. So I do hope we'll look at long-term protection of this resource, and it's going to be tough. It's a political issue. We all know where this goes and such, but there may have to be some hard choices made here. And licensing for all of us might be the thing we need to do. It may be expensive. Maybe we can find a way to do something like that. I would be very supportive of that. With that, thank you for your time again.
Thank you. We have no more speakers.
Ben,
You're
you're
on
on
mute.
mute.
How about if we does it work if we do a 5-minute break and we reconvene at 5 minutes after, and then we'll knock out the final 2 presentations, not knock them out, but engage them.
Works for me.
Okay.
Sure.
So 5 after 12, we'll reconvene. Super.
Okay, we're resuming. Let's go ahead.
Okay, welcome back. I'm glad everyone ignored my 5 minutes after 12 and knew what I meant. So thank you for that. So now we'll move into the long-term water supply discussion that Paul's going to lead.
Okay, good morning. I'm Paul Sellier, Operations Director. Our long-term water supply, which is today a focus on our supplemental water that we obtain from Sonoma County Water Agency. Before I get into it though, I would like to just make a comment on the photograph on this opening splash screen that Jeannie has put together. And I've seen it several times today, but every time I look at it, it just strikes me as it's really almost a perfect photograph in terms of its composition, color, and vividness. And, you know, much appreciated. I think it's a great photograph and adds to all the presentations that we've seen today. So thanks to Jeannie and her team for that. Okay, back on topic. Today's discussion, we're going to run through a brief overview of our Sonoma County Water Agency supply. We're going to take a dip into the Potter Valley project and give you a quick update on that, and the discussion on reliability and resilience just briefly again. And dovetailing with that, we're going to look at our Sonoma County Water Agency's system, just a brief overview there, dip into hydraulics, going to keep the math to an absolute bare minimum on that one. And that's just going to lead us into a discussion on potential for projects. And of course, our access to this water is governed by agreements with both Sonoma County Water Agency and North Marin. And we'll close with, wrap up with our commitment to the board on these key issues, needs and opportunities going forward. So the Potter Valley project, you know, what is it and why do we care? Well, I think everybody knows for the most part, but briefly, you know, water from the Eel River watershed, which is about 400 feet in elevation higher than the Russian River watershed below it. So the water is transferred from the Eel River through a tunnel through the Potter Valley hydroelectric plant, generates electricity. Instead of a once through flow, that water goes into the Russian River, Lake Mendocino, and then out to the coast. And recently in 2019, I think February of 2019, PG&E, after a long history of operating this project, sort of abandoned the renewal of their permit to operate the hydro project. And so in response to this, sort of through cajoling and efforts of Jared Huffman's office, a group of partners called the Two Basin, being the Russian River and Eel River Basin, formed a partnership, informal at first, and then they signed a planning agreement through which they are seeking to basically replace PG&E in the FERC, the Federal Energy Commission's process for a license to operate this hydro project. And just quickly stepping back, of course, we care about this because, as I mentioned, the water going from Eel to the Russian River is a substantial volume of water, something like 62,000 acre feet per year. So it's a big, a huge amount of water that comes into the Russian River watershed through that system. Back to the partners. So they've signed a planning agreement. They're taking over or attempting to take over the application, the renewal application that PG&E had started. And I believe the FERC has recognized the Two Basin Partner Group as a proxy agency or a proxy for an agency to be formed at some later date. And that agency would, of course, manage the rest of the application project and the project as it continues. The partners include Sonoma County Water Agency, Mendocino County Inland Water and Power, California Trout, and Humboldt County. And I think they were joined by the Round Valley Indian Tribe. And I think there's maybe some attempt, and I'm not clear just yet on whether Lake County is going to join this group. So as this group moves forward, the time frame over which this application process is going to play out really is unknown at this point, as is the implications of an outcome of it in terms of how would it potentially affect the cost of Sonoma County Water Agency water. I think the one thing that we do know is that it's going to be a long process, and costly. And that is, at this point, I think all I can really share with you on the Potter Valley project in terms of an update as it relates to long-term water supply. Looking at this slide, I'm just going to zoom in here just to give you a quick idea. I don't know if folks can see that, but this is sort of the geography of what we've just been talking about with the Eel River here, and then the powerhouse and the transfer through the tunnel into the Russian River and Lake Mendocino, and then out to the coast. So with that backdrop, then it's really, we consider ourselves extremely fortunate to have a local water supply that we can rely on. We have almost 80,000 acre feet on the mountain and out with Sulahuli and Nicasio, serving an annual potable demand of about 24,000 acre feet per year. And looking at our partners to the north, the Sonoma County Water Agency has 2 lakes, Mendocino and Sonoma, of course, with a total of 360,000 acre feet. In terms of resiliency and reliability, the district has gone through the Water Resources Plan 2040, which was completed in 2017. And that looked at a variety of disturbances to our supply, concluding that we have a portfolio of water supply adequate to take us through a 4-year drought. Sonoma County, however, does not have a similar document, but their resiliency study is in progress. And I would note that they serve a potable demand of about 50,000 acre feet per year. And just kind of interestingly, Lake Sonoma, since it was filled, I think in 1983, has never gone below the 100,000 acre foot storage level. So it seems to be a very robust supply of water. Looking then a little closer at our access to this water, we have rights to purchase up to 14,300 acre feet of water per year. And we're required to purchase 5,300 acre feet per year. And that's been our typical purchase for several years now. Over the record that I could find, we've never been able to purchase more than 9,000 acre feet per year. And so the question remains, how can we make use of this almost 5,000 acre feet of water that remains available to us? So this is where we get into a little bit on the hydraulics. And again, I'm going to just zoom in because I think it's helpful to just look at the geography here a little bit. The collectors that are referred to up here, these are the Rainy collectors. And this is a overview schematic of their system, of the Sonoma County Water Agency system map. So the water travels from the collectors through 2 pipelines to the south, which join up at the Cotati intertie. And this is Eli Booster Station here, just on the north side of Petaluma. The Eli Booster Station has a capacity of around 33 million gallons per day. And the water then travels through Petaluma, serving a demand there into Castagna Tank. And from Castagna Tank, it's through the North Marin Aqueduct down to our Ignacio pump station. So this is the very, very light math that I promised earlier. So if we have a capacity of 33 MGD at Eli Booster Station, and we know Petaluma has had a demand in the last few years of around 10 MGD, that leaves, by my calculation, 23 MGD at the Castagna Tank. And we know that the North Marin Aqueduct, which was recently upgraded to be a gravity pipeline, has an 18 MGD gravity capacity. And we also know through our experience that during the summertime, that 18 MGD constrains us. So North Marin, we would like to take more water than we're currently permitted to. So, right, if we have a capacity in Castagna of 23 MGD and only 18 MGD going through the North Marin Aqueduct, right, that leaves us with approximately 5 million gallons a day of available water supply. So the question that we really need to answer is, how can we get access to this 5 million gallons per day? And of course, we think we know the answer, but maybe a more considered approach and a closer look at hydraulics and the whole system might provide us with some different options and opportunities. So, of course, our access to this water is really governed by two agreements, one with Sonoma County Water Agency, which is a complex multi-part agreement sort of reflecting the history of the agency's engagement over the years. And today, though, we do have similar rights to purchase water, similar to the prime contractors. We, of course, don't have a vote, and our contracts for water supply with the agency are 10-year periods, which sounds like a reasonable amount of time, but I think we all understand that water supply projects typically have a very long time horizon to develop. And even in this case, although we're 5 years away from renewing this agreement, we're starting the process of looking through the contract to identify items that can be eliminated, simplified, and improved. The North Marin Agreement, by contrast, is simple to use and understand. It's a long-term agreement that expires in 2040. However, it does reflect that our use of the aqueduct is subordinate to North Marin Water District needs. And again, that translates to we don't get to use the water in the quantity that we would like to when we would like to. Our commitment to the board on these items as we go forward is to, in terms of the Potter Valley, to keep attending meetings. Now, we're not a direct member, obviously, of the Two Basin Solution Partnership Group, but there is a group that meets and has access to the information that is given to all of the contractors and the district regarding this project. And we will keep attending those meetings and provide the board regular updates whenever there are significant milestones. Similarly, on the Sonoma County Water Agency Resiliency Project, we're going to continue to participate and provide updates to the board as we go forward over the next year. And in terms of the hydraulics that we just mentioned, and this discussion of how can we better use that supplemental water from Sonoma County Water Agency staff, I'm sure we'll be back to the board in the next year with information items on this subject. So that's all I had for this morning. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
I have a question, Paul.
Yep.
As part of the Potter Valley project, I think the two dams were scheduled to come out, Cape Horn and Scott Dam, I guess. But I also heard that there was some significant resistance to taking out Scott Dam from the Pillsbury Lake people. What is the status of that? Is that a go, or have they stopped it?
I'm not sure there's an answer that's been shared with the prime contractors at this point. I think there's some discussion as to whether Lake County could be brought into the discussion, because of course Pillsbury sort of sits in Lake County. Seems like a bit of an omission to me, but in terms of Scott Dam, that is still part of the key part, removal of Scott Dam. That is the dam that forms Lake Pillsbury. That is still a key part of the proposal of the partnership group going forward. So that component hasn't been removed, at least not officially or in any way that I've heard. I know
I can add a little bit here if the board is interested, because I've been working a lot with the Potter Valley group. Just to augment, if it's okay, what Paul is saying, the current proposal by the partners is that Scott's Dam would be removed. However, there's a lot more study that needs to be done. The partners just submitted an initial study plan on September 14th. There's actually going to be open meeting on September 29th, whereby the consultants for the partners will be presenting all of the proposals that they have put together so far. As far as Lake County, their participation in the partnership is somewhat up in the air, though unlikely that they will become a member of the partnership. I think there was some discussion about that, but they are being included now in the conversation regarding the possibilities going forward with the project, and obviously the impact to Lake County and the, because of the potential loss of Lake Pillsbury. But I don't know that there's any formal discussion about bringing them into the partnership formally. I think that there's more questions I'd be happy to add, but hopefully that answers being asked.
Thanks for the presentation, Paul. And looking at the way you're thinking about long-term supply, I'm again concerned that you don't have efficiency as a piece of that. I think obviously we need to be looking closely at our partnership with Sonoma. I think it's great that you're bringing all of this forward. But I also think it's essential that we reframe the way we're thinking about supply and bring in efficiency. I don't think that these options that you've got listed here in the document can really be evaluated if we don't have a clear sense about the extent to which enhanced efficiency and conservation measures can address our long-term water supply needs. Be great to hear your thinking for separating those things.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting comments that you made both now and earlier, and difficult for staff to answer at this time, but just in a bit of a gamble on my part, perhaps. I think the efficiency component that you're talking about, and rightly so, needs to be stood up next to the projects that we're talking about here, or potential projects, as a comparative and evaluating them in terms of water supply, as you suggest. What do they bring to the table? How can they reduce the capacity perhaps that we might need in a pump station, for example, if we were to allocate certain resources toward developing either centralized or decentralized? I'm thinking recycled water, for example,
Exactly.
gray water, or other neighborhood style reuse projects. So I hear you. I think it's so I'm happy you brought it up. It forces us out of our comfort zone to do those things. So I really appreciate that.
Okay, well, that's great. So it sounds like we're aligned. And just to be clear, I know that the terminology can be challenging. And so when I'm using, so thank you for that, Paul. So I mean efficiency in that broadest sense, exactly as you've described, whether it's, on-site recycling, centralized recycling, gray water. I mean, there's a universe, obviously, of, measures and actions, both at the institutional level, at the neighborhood level, and even at the, individual parcel level for businesses and residences. So I see these things as integrated. I see them less as either or and more both and. And I think done correctly and at large scale, there may be situations where some of these more expensive, and more politically challenging alternatives, can either be deferred or found to be unnecessary to meet our needs. So I would like to see those considered side by side. Thank you.
One other thing I'd like to comment on is the 10,000 acre feet a year that we're releasing for habitat. So as you know, we're going to be doing another Lagunitas Creek plan going forward. We've done quite a bit of habitat restoration out on the west end of Lagunitas Creek, and whether that plan would consider variation in the amount of water that we need to release to sustain the watershed. So it just may be another area where we can where we could save a significant amount of water. So it's not quite the same thing as Cynthia's points, which I totally agree with and think are really quite valuable and important as far as our planning. But it's just another component of this whole, all these moving parts that you guys need to be looking at holistically as we go forward.
Yeah, I heard that in Sean's presentation, I think some time ago, bringing that Lagunitas Creek project forward. Very often those can go the other way, of course, right? But it is interesting to note and that it could go in our favor, I suppose. Something to watch for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen, Director Bregman, opportunities to look at the timing of releases and pulse releases and that sort of stuff that can result in a net reduction in releases, but maybe an enhancement for the purpose of the releasing for the environment. So putting science behind it and taking a look at it, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Any other board comments? Terry, do we have any public comments on this?
We do not have any at this time.
Okay, with that, we'll move into drought planning, and Carrie, I believe, is going to give this one.
Yes, I am. And Terry is going to do the slideshow for me. Thank you, Terry. Almost good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to be covering the drought planning update. Next slide. Let's start with an overview. We're going to look at the current drought planning that the district has in place. So that includes district codes, work that's already been done to date around the 2040 Water Resource Plan, and then also discuss current operational actions, some of which directly relate to Paul's previous presentation. So that's great. And then we'll wrap up with the legislative and regulatory changes that the district needs to comply with, specifically around the Urban Water Management Plan and the development of a water shortage contingency plan. Thank you. Starting with the current district codes, there are 3 specific codes around drought planning within that the district has in place and on the books. They include a 10% reduction goal, a 25% reduction goal, and a water shortage emergency. And I'll go into greater detail on each one of those. But first, we're going to start with the declaration of purpose, which is also within our code. It calls out that the dry year program, so our drought programs, will be developed and triggered with triggers based on lake storages and using a computer simulation looking at current reservoir levels and the amount of imported water that we have available. So the computer simulations we're referring to here were first developed back in 1989. They were updated then in 1995 when our water rights changed. And then once again in 2017, or 2016, I thought it was 16, but Paul just corrected me that it's 2017 as part of the 2040 Water Resource Plan. Next slide. So jumping into the actual stages, that's how I'll refer to them, starting with the 10% reduction goal. The trigger for this stage is that on April 1st, we look at lake storage levels, and if it's below 50,000 acre feet, then there will be a voluntary call to action to reduce demands by 10%. This would come into play via a board action to activate this call to action. Upon approval by the board, then emergency water rates would automatically come into place, increasing water rates for potable, recycled, and raw waters by 10%. So it's effective on the date of the board's action for enacting that 10% reduction goal. The code also calls out a review of financial reserves to determine if we need to make changes in our tier breaks. In doing a bit of research, looking over the last 35 years, only in 1999, only once in 1990, storage was below 50,000 acre feet on April 1st. So of course, this is in the middle of the 1987 to 92 drought. So that does definitely make sense. Next slide. Looking at the 25% reduction goal, the trigger here is again, once again on April 1st, if lake storage is below 40,000 acre feet, then that would result in a mandatory call to action if enacted by the board. This mandatory call to action it's actually within the code. It provides a methodology for how to allocate a water budget for every customer type. So I have on here on the slide Resi 1 through 5, which is our single family, multifamily codes. The language within the code says that there'll be an allotment per resident to achieve an aggregate of 32% reduction in demands by all customers. So that's within the code. That would be how we would implement this and roll it out. Which I'll discuss a little bit more in a moment. And then for the other sectors, so institutional, business, irrigation, et cetera, there's a specific percent of their water budget that they would be required to reduce by. It also called out some specific water waste prohibitions that would need to come into play. So, no new turf areas, not serving water in restaurants unless, requested, irrigation hours, et cetera. So there's some specific actions. As I mentioned, this would be activated via the board resolution. It would also result in emergency water rates, increasing them by 25% effective date on the effective date of the board's action. And the code also actually includes some penalty rates. And so the penalty rates are tied to this allotment. So if you exceed your allotment, then you can be charged a penalty rate, which leads us down the path that if the majority of our customers are residential customers, determining their allocation would be quite difficult. And as a result, we would not actually be able to use the penalty rate trigger or mechanism to impact water demands. And that's because, we would need to know how many people are in each household. And if we're looking at multifamily, then how many units and how many people are in each unit, and, divvying that up, it would become quite a challenge. So looking back at historic storage levels, since 1984, storage has never been below 40,000 acre feet on April 1st. The third stage we have in the books is a water shortage emergency. So this looks at lake storage levels on December 1st. And if storage is below 30,000, in the vicinity of or less than 30,000 acre feet, then the board can activate by resolution an emergency shortage. Note that there's no specific target amount. So there's no 50%, et cetera. It just kind of is an open for staff and the board to decide in that instance. It does also trigger emergency water rates, which the rates increase by 50%. So when staff, you'll hear staff talk about this third trigger, this emergency storage, and we generally look at it as a 50% reduction just because it seems to make sense based on the increase in rates and the way the other codes are written. It also looks at penalty rates. It also looks at penalty rates similar to the last, the 25% reduction. So looking at how has this ever happened or how often this happened? So it did occur in 1990. No resolution was ever enacted. And the interesting thing is that by April of 91, storage was at 52,000 acre feet. So the other triggers would not have been hit either. So you should all be familiar with this, or at least seen this graph before. It's Paul presents it each month as part of the water supply update. And really, I just wanted to include it because it's a monthly graph illustrating the thresholds of the codes that I just reviewed. So, so you can kind of see each month how these are presented to you for in information provided by staff. So jumping into the work that's been done to date around water shortage contingency plans. So as part of the 2040 Water Resource Plan, there was a draft water shortage contingency plan developed. It's an appendix to that report. I will note it was never formally adopted by the board, so this is just something that's been on the shelf, but I think it will help inform and provide some direction and a starting point as we move forward into the regulatory compliance, which I'll cover in a moment. So this draft water shortage community plan increases our stages from 3 to 5, which is great. It also looks at specific water supply conditions, so lake storage levels specifically around the triggers, which is good. It details prohibited uses in each stage. It discusses district actions for each of those stages. It includes public outreach, might be rebates, surveys, whatever else we might be implementing to respond to the drought. And then also how we would utilize emergency storage. This draft plan does go into detail on variances and penalties, which is important that we have those worked out prior to us being in a situation where there's a drought and where we need to be responsive and already have a plan in place. So that's helpful, and I think that's forward thinking and something that I certainly appreciate. And finally, it suggests the use of rate stabilization funds when we are in a drought. So charging to capital and initiating potential furloughs to acknowledging that there will be revenue impacts. Next slide. And now looking at current operational actions. So there's a number of actions that may not be included in our code, but they're more really kind of standard operating procedures that staff looks at as we consider current water supply and you know, what steps we need to take to ensure that we have water supply that we need. First is during dry years, of course, we can reduce the discharges, so in-stream flows for Lake Lagunitas, which was just mentioned. The second item is adjusting SQA imports, and so timing and quantity, again, Paul's presentation covered that in detail, so I won't go into that. We do a internal analysis using modeling to look at projected water supplies, and that modeling also includes climate models, so looking at La Nina and El Nino, and then looking out 2-year projections on climate changes. Reservoir transfer, so there's 2 possible reservoir transfers that could be done within our system, listed there. And then finally, as mentioned, requesting a temporary change petition to the State Water Resources Control Board is an option. It's never actually been done. Our friends to the north do it each year, so the water does it each year. But you know, we all need to acknowledge that it definitely could open the door to additional mandates and imposing restrictions on other types of restrictions on our water rights. And so just being aware of that, but it certainly could be something that is, you know, implemented down the road if determined to be appropriate. So now I'm going to shift gears into the regulatory changes that we're seeing. So as part of the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan, the state is requiring that a water shortage contingency plan be included based on the response from the last drought, the 2014-2016 drought, and the variations of implementation across the state. The state has determined that they want 6 standard water shortage levels, and those stages are listed there. So we'll need to go from 3 to 6. And the other thing that they've changed is the acknowledgement that this would apply to any water shortage. So it's not just drought. It could be, you know, power outage, earthquake, emergency, any sort of emergency event that impacts water supply would then trigger this water shortage contingency plan. The state does allow a trigger for each stage to be unique to our local water supply conditions. So we can determine, you know, what each trigger is for each stage. They require a communication protocol and specific procedures. So not only how will we notify our customers of each stage, specifically how will we notify them, but also how will we coordinate with other local jurisdictions, so our local cities, towns, and the county on implementation and enforcement and compliance. Next slide. Next slide, Terry. Thank you. Continuing on, they're requiring that each stage have some specific details. So this will include supply augmentation actions, demand reduction actions, so what types of efficiency and conservation programs will be rolling out within each stage, what operational changes will be made within each stage, and what mandatory prohibitions will we be enforcing during each stage. The state wants us to include some information on financial consequences of reducing demand. So what do we project the demand reductions and expenses demand reductions and revenue reductions to be? And in turn, what expenses do we anticipate increasing? So increased expenses might be, water waste patrols, it might be increased conservation spending, additional outreach, additional cost of imported water, et cetera. And then also looking at mitigation actions to address how are we going to, cover those reductions in expenses. Additionally, part of this water shortage contingency plan will be an annual water supply and demand assessment submitted to the state each year, with the district determining if we project we will be landing in any stage during that year. So each year we'll be notifying the state of water supply availability for the upcoming year. So quickly on next steps, we'll be looking at determining methodology for the trigger. So acknowledging that we need to go from three stages to 6 to meet the state requirements. What do those triggers look like? And is a lake level and date the best methodology to use for the district? We'll be looking at drought messaging and working closely with Jeannie's team on having some package drought messaging out and ready to go, so that once again, when we step into the need to engage in one of these stages, we're not trying to create material at the last minute, the 9th hour. And finally, all of this will be wrapped up into the urban water management plan. We have a consultant that's been selected. They have a water shortage contingency plan as a specific task within that scope. We anticipate a draft in February of 2021, and then of course the water shortage contingency plan will need to be submitted as part of the urban water management plan in July of 2021. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions you may have.
I have a question, Carrie. Are you sure about that statement that we never hit 50,000 acre feet? I mean, in 76, Sulahui didn't exist. So the number must have been lower. And it was my understanding from a previous board member that basically, if we hadn't had the pipeline across the bridge, we would have gone dry in 77 or thereabouts. So, I mean, it's not a big deal, but I just question because I think we must have hit it in 76.
Sure, Larry. So I only went back to 1984 because that was the data that I had readily available to me.
Okay.
I'm sure we have historic records somewhere, but last 35
That's fine.
years.
That's fine. Yeah, we should probably add that caveat in there since 84.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. So I'm going to come back to my recurring theme. Well, two things actually. On the efficiency and reuse side, I think what's going to be important for us in terms of drought planning, Carrie, is getting, sort of doing another click down and getting really specific on quantification, right? Like how much water are we really talking about that we have available potentially under different drought scenarios from different efficiency and reuse interventions, as opposed to some of the, not as opposed to, but in addition to some of the augmentation event interventions. And I think to really do this planning, we're going to need to see the cost side as well. And of course, the cost side is going to depend on financing, right? Costs are going to change dramatically depending on whether we're trying to pay for things with grants or out of operating funds, or if we're going to finance in the same way that we finance other long-term investments. So that's my first thought. And then my second is, with drought planning, as we're seeing now, as a result of COVID, we're going to run into folks who are not going to be able to easily absorb these increases in rates. So I think any drought planning, I think as you go down this path, I'm going to want to see in the drought planning, what is our contingency for working with our customers who are, in more challenging situations financially, right? Because even in a drought, we want to make sure that those folks are getting the amount of water that they need for health and safety and sanitation. And at the same time, we don't, so we need to be really thinking through what are the financial implications for our more vulnerable communities, and what can we be putting into place beforehand so that we're not running into a crisis of, the dual crisis that we are now, that, our revenues are going to be declining at the same time that we need to be providing additional support for vulnerable communities. So I think I think that financial piece for those vulnerable communities needs to be part and parcel of the planning up front.
Great.
I think a comment there, Cynthia, is that that is the purpose of the rate stabilization fund. You know, it's still a drought fund. But you bring up a very interesting point, which is, and maybe Chuck could talk to this for a moment. How do we use the rate stabilization fund? And how low are we willing to let it go? To zero?
Right. The rate stabilization fund is to keep the district fiscally strong. I'm really talking about the other side of this, which is how do we deal with our customers who are simply not going to be able to address, you know, not going to be able to work within the increased rate, you know, the increased financial hits that we're looking at here.
It's the same side, because if you use the rate stabilization fund, you don't increase the rates.
Well, okay. I mean, I'm just saying one way or another, we're looking at a hit to our consumers.
No, not necessarily. If you use the rate stabilization fund, there's no increase, right? It just is absorbed. That's the purpose of the rate stabilization fund.
Right.
So,
all I'm saying is that we can't necessarily, the money is coming from somewhere, and a lot of it has to do with timing. I'm just saying, I think we need to be looking at the consumer impact on the vulnerable, and we do have them, the vulnerable members of this service area.
absolutely, couldn't agree more on that part. The other thing I think, Carrie, that you didn't talk about at all, you glanced about, but is direct potable reuse. I think that is something that needs to be integrated into the thinking process. You know, I presume when you're talking about reclaimed water, you're talking about an extension of the existing system as opposed to direct potable.
Yes, that's been the typical way we've thought about it here. Certainly direct potable is out there. We are firmly in line right behind North Marin in moving the county into direct potable. No, I'm kind of joking about that, but it is an area that we're all watching as the technology progresses and acceptance, and we benefit in some of the activities in the South Bay as we watch that. Certainly from a recycled water, that's most cost effective in most cases. Of course, it has acceptance issues and concerns along those lines. So I think that's not front and center for us, Director Russell, but it is an area we do need to continue to monitor and engage in what we're doing. So
I'm not sure I agree with you, Ben. San Quentin is our largest water user, and they're immediately adjacent to CMSA's treatment plant. I think the potential for direct potable reuse for San Quentin is high. You know, now I don't know, you know, the water reuse meeting was supposed to be in San Francisco in this summer. It didn't happen. So I'm not exactly sure how things got shaken out, because they were going to make an update on where we stand with respect to all the money that was spent with the state of California doing the studies. But we must be pretty close to the end point of those reports about the feasibility, which, you know, as I understand those reports, the intent was to have the Department of Health Services, or DDW, relook at the standards. So I think we should probably get an update on that someday, you know, when we can. But we should start thinking about a bigger approach than just, you know, dual plumbing and all that, especially with San Quentin, because being that biggest water use, I mean, you know, you talk about the things Cynthia's talking about. Well, there's one that's perfect, right? You take the largest water user off of our system and provide them with a different source, potentially. So it would have, you know, significant impacts on our water budget.
That's a good point.
So, Carrie, there's a study that was done some time ago by James Fryer, which addresses a lot of the issues of integrating efficiency into our operations. And I can send that to you. It's probably about 10 or 12 years old, but it's a really comprehensive study and financial evaluation of all the different efficiency and conservation measures, which I think you should really take a look at. And I think it really speaks to what Cynthia has been emphasizing, which I totally agree with. I mean, this really needs to be part of our DNA going forward, as it has been, really. But I think it just needs to be sort of elevated a little bit in our planning awareness. So I'll send that to you when I get back into my office. I think you'll like taking a look at it.
I'd be surprised if she doesn't have that in her office. No?
I haven't come across it.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah.
I will email it to you in a few minutes.
Right, thank you.
It's really informative. So,
good. I'll take a look.
Yeah, good.
We do have one public comment if we can take that. Roger Roberts.
I just have an open question. It appears that we can define our own definition of when we're in drought in accordance with reservoir capacity and how much we have on hand. My question is a legal question: does the state, who's instituting this new drought management plan, have any overarching definitions of how drought is defined?
No, they don't. They've provided to us the stages that we need to be prepared to enact, so the 6 stages, but the triggers are left up to the local jurisdiction based on local conditions.
Thank you.
I have no further comments.
Okay, any more comments or discussion on this item?
I don't know if Paul is still on the line, but in regard to responding to what Roger just said, Paul had made I thought, a very interesting comment at our last board meeting regarding the different definitions of drought that we have versus the state. And Paul, if you can explain that better than me. You did an outstanding job the other day.
Lucky I can find my way home, Director Gibson, most days. I don't recall the specific comments I made.
Well, actually, to refresh your memory, what you said was that we define drought by our reservoir levels, and the state defines drought by rainfall.
Yes, that's right. I did make that comment. Thank you for the nudge. My cognitive dissonance, I think Director Quintero used to call it.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes, the state does, according to the state, right, some 80% of California is experiencing drought conditions right now. And that's the distinction, right? Drought conditions versus drought. And when you look at the reservoir levels in the state reservoirs, they're still all tracking fairly normal storage levels. So it really gets to the question of Carrie's presentation, and the intention of the new regulation is to try to understand what is a meaningful drought trigger, and how do we come up with it. And those are not easy questions, for sure.
Couldn't agree more, Paul. But I will say this: we looked at this pretty heavily about 2 years ago, and because I was skeptical of the work that was done 30 years ago, but the numbers are pretty good. They seem to work, and I think you did the analysis. They seem to work statistically. So they obviously had their arms around this when they did the evaluation.
Okay, any further comments or discussion on this item? Okay, just as we wrap up, I wanted to note what I did earlier, that these were 5 of the 10 items that you had in your packet, and the other 5 are certainly quite important: safety and emergency response, employee engagement, sustainability, our new website and water efficiency and all of those. Some of them we have been keeping the board apprised, and all of them going forward we will at future meetings. From what you heard today, obviously we have a lot of work, a lot of good work ahead of us this coming year that we'll be working on as staff and bringing to the board and engaging the community on. So I think it's going to be a rich, exciting, and busy year. I also wanted to thank all the work from staff that was put into putting together the materials today for the retreat. So with that, I don't know if there's any final comments from the board, and we'll conclude the meeting.
Well, I put my congratulations too. It's a great package and an effective meeting. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much for putting it together, Ben. It was great.
Very thorough.
Well done. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. So we'll conclude the meeting since we've hit all our public comments, I believe. Right?
One comment, Ben, the watershed is going to close tomorrow evening. So we got an announcement from, it was a public announcement on the media today that there's going to be red flag this weekend.
Crystal, do you?
Yes, they just announced that the red flag warning goes into effect starting Saturday at 9 p.m.
Saturday night, yeah.
Until Monday at 8 a.m. And in accordance with red flag events, we will be closing the watershed.
I think we should be careful there, Crystal, to say it's closed to vehicles, because it's not closed, right? It's just closed to vehicles.
We had this discussion, Larry.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an ongoing discussion. It is a.
Oh, but it's factual, right?
Strategic ambiguity.
Well, maybe, but I mean, it causes people to have, anxiety because they say, can I go on the watershed or not? And the answer is yes, right? Under our current rules.
It's not just vehicles. We also.
So this wasn't agendized, Crystal. I see our attorneys sitting up straight, so I don't want to get too far into this, but.
Attorneys do.
So I'm reluctant to cut it off. I think at subsequent watershed meetings,
It was just a heads up on my.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Okay, with that, President Gibson, if it works for you, we'll conclude the meeting.
The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Bye.